someone either taking a hit to the head or indirectly to the rest of the body, whereby the head moves in such a way that the brain inside it is also twisting and contorting inside the actual skull. Most of the time that results in a concussion. The problem is people are not sure of what they expect to see when a concussion has occurred. So people affiliate concussions with, for example, a knockout or being unconscious, but that's like 15% of the time. The remaining 85%, they're actually still walking, but they may have other symptoms.
Hi, welcome to Unapologetically You with myself, Tulse. Unfortunately, Kelly is missing in action today, so I'm missing my co-host. But I am so excited to talk to Nasir Uddin today, where we talk about concussions, neuromuscular fatigue. We talk about being a British Asian in sport and sports scientists. So please stay tuned and listen to his incredible insights and expertise. For those who aren't already aware, we are able to give you all brand new access to our podcast and green room chats on Patreon. So please do check that out for a small fee. Please do support us. That would be greatly appreciated. And if you have any suggestions, that is the way to get in contact with us. So stay tuned and listen to the amazing Nas talk about his work. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am so happy to introduce Nasir Uddin, is one of our guests who applies his expertise in physical performance and brain health in all forms of combat using basic and applied physiology research. Now, Nasir is an exercise physiologist and a lecturer in sports science, and he's undertaking his PhD at St Mary's University in London. His aim is to help students, scientists, and athletes learn about basic physiology, as well as interpreting combat-related sports. What I find interesting about Nasir is his research, which looks at neurophysiological changes after concussions and hypohydration. Nas delves deeper into brain injury, neurodegeneration, fatigue, hydration, and combat sports. With all of that experience and expertise, I am so happy and excited to introduce Nas as a guest on our podcast, Unapologetically You. Nas, first, what a background. Thanks so much for taking time out of your week to speak to us. Well, me.
No, thanks for having me on. Thanks for
Moment.
having me on. That's all right.
Awesome. So thank you again, for taking time out for speaking to us and, carving out time in your day. You sound like you've got a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, that would be an understatement. It's always either between marking, data analysis. I mean, COVID's not had me traveling, so that's one thing. But yeah, I'm in front of a screen nearly all day, every day. It's not exactly what I imagined life as a PhD student or a lecturer, but I mean, it is what it is. So
yeah, definitely. You're adapting, I guess, which is what
I guess so.
doing. Yeah. And how is everything regarding online lecturing, and how are you finding things like, focusing on your PhD and things like that? Because a lot of people find it quite gruesome in terms of the amount of time that you have to spend in terms of it, but balancing the work, obviously balancing the research aspect of things as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I'm in a fortunate position, which normally most people won't say, but I might talk about this maybe later. But like, I'm not funded by any particular university organization. So, generally speaking, some people might have seen that as a downside. But in this particular situation, whether I get to do research or not, I'm not affected in any way by timelines. So that's worked out for me. I'm still getting to do some elements of research. I mean, we just released a survey, and hopefully that will come out over the next few months, where we've looked at concussions with combat athletes and some other factors as well. So I'm managing to do some research. It's not what I imagined I'd be doing. I imagined to be in the lab for at least, I mean, a ridiculous amount of hours in the day, but I miss that now because I've not got the opportunity to do that. And online lectures, it's subjective. I personally enjoy being in front of students, so it's not the same speaking to a blank screen. But I mean, at least it's something. So yeah, it's all weird, but I can't complain, to be honest.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it sounds insane. A lot of lecturers I'm speaking to just, yeah, that's the most awkward one, isn't it? It's you're so used to speaking to students and having them give you information,
Yeah.
come back at you. But with this one, it's kind of like, are they awake? Are they
Yeah,
there?
yeah. I mean, now I just settle for. I mean, once upon a time, I always used to wonder like why students were looking at me with raised eyebrows. I miss that now. I'm just like, if I could see one raised eyebrow where they're like, "What the hell is he talking about?" That'd be a relief, as opposed to, "Oh, I've handed the work in." So, yeah, yeah.
We won't broadcast that then. You'll
No.
get raised eyebrows next.
Yeah,
Wherever you go.
absolutely.
So what I find interesting about your expertise and your research is the area of concussion. And I know a couple of people actually who had dealt with concussion themselves, and there has been a huge surge of technology which I find interesting. It pre-warns medical staff, coaches, and organizations in various sports in the last decade or so. But through this change, there are players who are acting and taking concussions seriously, but some may not be delving deeply into being honest with their coaches and their managers, because obviously there's a lot of emphasis with the contracts and pay and things like that, and obviously
Absolutely.
playing. So the real question to start is, what have you experienced while studying changes in concussions with players who can speak the truth about their conditions and symptoms, and how do you convey this message using your knowledge and expertise?
I think a lot of the time when it comes to concussions, the difficulty is it's how it's perceived as an injury, and I think, like, to begin with, it's probably a disclaimer for anyone listening. I mean, we're all sports enthusiasts, we're all fans, we enjoy watching sports. Some of us listening, and such as ourselves, are coaches, some are athletes, and sometimes injuries expose a very harsh reality of sport behind the scenes, or even post retirement. So sometimes it sounds somewhat miserable, but hopefully we come off with a better understanding of the way the brain works. But generally speaking, I think if we're talking about things like combat sports, the risk is high, but generally there's big gaps between the next fight, so to speak. And in some sports, you've got, let's just say, for example, a concussion mid-play, and these are a lot of the time some of the worst case scenarios where, let's just say, the diagnosis on the side of the pitch, or I say diagnosis, but as in someone's done a sideline assessment,
Mm-hmm.
and they've kind of let them carry on playing. And I think obviously that's where a difficulty is as well, because the player sometimes themselves wants to keep going. The coach doesn't have that mentality where they would consider that to be something worth stopping the game for, or taking a player out for. So there's still quite a lot of negative attitudes around the concept of sitting it out when taking a knock to the head. And I think that comes down to a misunderstanding of what's truly going on in a concussion, like what is actually happening to the brain during this particular incident. So, I mean, to answer your question, I think it's a big problem where it's definitely underreported. There's always a percentage of athletes that admit to not reporting it to their coaches, but that's then confounded by factors such as not the right people being available to make the decisions on whether those players should be off or on. A lack of understanding of what a concussion is in the first place. So
Yeah,
all of those are being Yeah.
That's a really good point, actually. I just want you to kind of get our audience to understand, what would you say is a concussion and how do people notice the symptoms?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to go around it. I mean, there's the generic way to understand it, which is, generally speaking, if a person, let's just say, if we're imagining someone either taking a hit to the head or indirectly to the rest of the body, whereby the head moves in such a way that the brain inside it is also twisting and contorting inside the actual skull, most of the time that results in a concussion. The problem is, people are not sure of what they expect to see when a concussion has occurred. So people affiliate concussions with, for example, a knockout or being unconscious, but that's like 15% of the time. The remaining 85%, they're actually still walking, but they may have other symptoms such as just a slight bit of nauseousness or just a slight little alteration. I think the reason why people don't necessarily understand how serious a concussion can be is because it's an invisible injury. People would take an ACL injury a lot more seriously than a concussion, and the reason is because, like I said, they don't get to see what's going on. It's kind of like smoking. I mean,
Yeah.
you could, it's potentially bad, but you don't see the physical harm done to your lungs on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm.
So at some point you might call it quits, but until then you don't necessarily know what's going on. And I think the only reason why that's not understood is because I'll put it in an analogy really quickly, but we've all heard of neurons, we've all heard of the brain, and we all think of you know those kind of words in response to everything that we do on a day-to-day basis. But imagine we picture over 100 billion neurons all stuck together alongside another 100 billion cells, which are called glia cells, and they all kind of mush together in this little jelly-like structure, which only makes up about 1 to 2 kilos of our whole mass. Okay, and it's responsible for controlling the whole body. And anytime it kind of rotates, contorts, twists, or hits the inside of the skull, you're stretching some of those cells beyond repair sometimes. And at some points, when it stretches, let's just say it's starting to change the structure. It's starting to change all the connections and the messages being sent from the brain to the rest of the body. And as a result, it's not just unconsciousness. It's emotional disruptions. It's irritability. It's sometimes loss of sleep. And that's not even time frame. We're not even talking about time frame. So yeah, I mean, like I said, people think of it as a knock to the head, but it's not just a knock to the head, I'm afraid. It's a
Yeah.
lot more complicated. Yeah.
No, that's a really good explanation. Thank you. And I always imagine it as, correct me if I'm wrong. So, like, you've got a really good jelly mold and a really good wobble on the jelly. So the brain isn't really the jelly. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's the fluid around the brain that you would kind of look at it as the jelly-like structure, and the obviously
Correct.
knock that you would have.
Yeah.
Imagine the jelly wobbling quite apparently. You can actually see that analogy would actually mean that the fluid around the brain is just being disturbed, and then that in turn knocks in the neurological circuitry, which obviously affects sleep, focus, memory. Would all those things come into it as well?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously there are levels to this, because ultimately concussion comes under the category of mild traumatic brain injury, which is still one of the lesser of the major traumatic brain injuries that people are hospitalized for, such as potentially car accidents and much major trauma to the brain.
Mhm.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the brain is encased around what we call cerebrospinal fluid, and it acts as a dampener to some extent, or as a shock absorber. So ultimately, when you see these mini videos of the brain kind of just like going in, back and forth or side to side, it's never really that fast because the fluid kind of slows down the movement. But regardless of that, even if it is slower, it's, if you think about like an incident that leads to a concussion, it's still very rapid. So that rapid twist or that rapid move back and forth eventually still leads to this. So it's almost like a time lag. So for example, if there's an impact here, the head may fold in this way, then move back out that way, and then the brain is following. So the brain is kind of following thereafter and then hitting one side of the skull to the other side of the skull. And each time that's happening, there's a bit of shearing going on between those cells that are being hit, and that's the problem.
It's almost like in a car crash when people experience a whiplash, it's your head actually knocking forward and back, and then it was
correct. Yeah.
The impact of the neck obviously suffering that trauma in terms of the muscles. But that's really interesting. But going on that fact of speaking about traumatic brain injuries, what would you say are the long-term neurological effects of repetitive head trauma or concussions?
Yeah, I mean, so repetitive head trauma, I think the difficulty for me to go into that would be there's so much head trauma there's the variability of head trauma is quite large. But I think generally speaking, from, let's just say, a concussion point of view, I mean, dating back to the past century, where boxers who had died, people have looked at post-mortem brains, and things have progressed over the past 3-4 decades, where they've been looking at NFL players previously that passed away. And I think the big one that gets shouted out a lot is CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I mean, I don't know if you remember when that film came out by Will Smith called Concussion.
I don't even think I've seen it.
It's all right. So yeah, there was a film that came out by Will Smith. I mean, he was the main actor, and it was based on a doctor who's, I mean, still alive in America at the moment. His name's Dr. Bennett Omalu. And naturally, it being Hollywood, they obviously twisted some of the events of the storyline. But what they tried to do is show the storyline of how they discovered CTE, so to speak. But I think it's not, people kind of link all of these things together. It's not really that. I think what people need to think about is, first of all, the symptoms staying for a long time. There are studies that have looked at athletes who, for example, sustained their last concussion over 3 decades ago, but they still have some persisting symptoms. And then on the flip side of that, you're getting people that say, a week is fine, 10 to 14 days is fine. And, there's, just a recent study that came out this year, but 2020, but they were saying that only actually 44% of the people that they looked at recovered within that 10 to 14 day range, whereas the rest almost took a month. So there's variations in, first of all, symptom resolution. And then once we surpass that, then we're talking about what is chronically persisting, because concussions, I mean, people think about what it's done to the brain, but it's also what it's done to the rest of the body. So there's, hormonal dysregulation. There's studies that have seen testosterone decrease chronically for males, for example, post concussion. There's obviously sleep disturbances. There's memory loss. Now, memory loss is one of the bigger ones, and that's because later on, it tends to be linked to things like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and that's because of multiple reasons. Like, if you think about what concussions are doing bit by bit with each of these cells that are shearing or stretching, ultimately the stretching or the tearing of certain cells, that's not going to go unnoticed by the brain, and unfortunately the inflammatory responses that build up to deal with all of that unfortunately lead to secondary injuries, where the injury is compounding upon itself to the extent that it's almost becoming a toxic environment for the brain in itself. It goes into energy crisis, whereby the brain is utilizing more than it needs to, and then at some point certain areas of the brain are corroding away. So for example, white matter, these specific regions where the fat is found, which is responsible for all of these signals to go really fast. is actually slowing down. So all of our connections are slowing down bit by bit. So I mean, there's so many consequences which are hard to pinpoint, and it would be unfair for me to say that there is one or two consequences. But I think what we need to think about is some of these symptoms may persist for a long period of time, depending on how many concussions you've received. There is obviously a risk of dementia, Alzheimer's, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is, its diagnosis is still very unclear. It cannot be diagnosed until after death, and it tends to have a lot of overlap with symptoms of Alzheimer's as well. So it's not really easy to diagnose. But there are so many other factors as well, which researchers are still looking at now. So it's an open field right now.
You're looking at Pandora's box, basically, aren't you? When it comes
absolutely. I can definitely say there are no positive neurological consequences. So
no, I don't think there would be.
Yeah.
I like the way that you've explained that the month is a normal recovery. I had a friend who went through the same thing. He had lots of headaches, lots of nausea, and he was in agony for quite a long time. And it took at least past the 14 days for him to actually begin to feel like his normal self, but it was still carrying on, and it kind of prevented him from playing football and getting back on the pitch. But
yeah,
I know that you've touched on the symptoms quite a lot before this conversation, but in terms of if our listeners have children, there's a two-part question to this. Is there a specific age where you are most vulnerable to concussions? And what advice would you give parents whose children are involved in combat sports from a very young age? Because combat sports is quite an early thing to do, isn't it? I mean, I know you pick it up later on, but lots of people in karate, taekwondo, judo, things like that. It's a done thing for when your kids are little, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer the first question, I'm afraid I can't, like, off the top of my head, I won't be able to quote anything that directly would say a specific age. But if we're going with specific high risk populations, it would definitely be obviously children with developing brains, because neurodevelopment hasn't still fully occurred in some cases. And then females as well tend to be at higher risk of longer symptom resolution. So studies that have compared male and female recovery generally find that females take a longer period of time to recover. And I'm afraid I don't actually know the whole physiology behind why that would potentially be the case, because it's not fully the scope of my research. But also, when we're talking about adolescent concussions as well, we're dealing with potentially a developing brain, and also sometimes this lack of understanding in terms of what the consequences of their actions are within a game if they've not been taught very well. When it comes to concussions, like specifically within combat sports, especially for developing children, I think it's a difficult one, because especially if they're getting involved in a striking sport, it makes it quite difficult, because obviously the focus is to attack for the opponent's head. I think there's a couple levels to this, because generally speaking, the difficulty is making sure that concussion knowledge is understood. A lot of people would be like, well, you're ruining the game, like you're ruining the sport, and that this happens a lot. A lot of people think that injury researchers are just making the game more soft, so to speak. And the other issue is that we're not trying to ruin it, but we are trying to make sure that everyone that goes into this is just aware of what they're getting themselves into. It's quite interesting that we're mentioning combat sports, because just the other day, one of the guys who won a UFC fight, I think just a couple of days ago, he landed the most significant strikes in the whole fight in, I think, UFC history. But after the fight, he said that he tries to not spar very often in his own camps, and he sent the message out saying, you guys only get one brain, so save it. And I mean, the irony in him landing the most strikes on his opponent, but also saying he doesn't spar very often and you only get one brain. I think that in itself is quite telling, because you can get involved in combat sports. That's absolutely fine. But I think the need to put yourself in a situation where you are taking hits to the head is unnecessary. You can train for that to some extent, especially if you're getting involved in mixed martial arts. There are so many other parts of combat sports to work on, such as your grappling, your ground game, jiu-jitsu, kicks, blocks, and everything else. There's no reason to take these shots on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You see some ridiculous training techniques where people are almost concussing themselves to get better or increase their threshold. Like, you're only just adding damage to what is potentially a meter of how much damage you can take.
Yeah.
So, there's no point.
So you're advocating just more technical efficiency, proficiency, seeking the right professionals, and then learning around that one technique. You don't have to then execute that one strike, but you can have a whole plethora of skills that can still make you a good fighter. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Because if you think about the main sport that advocates shots to the head, it's boxing. But even in boxing, the main thing about boxing is not getting hit. There's never been praise or glory for the person. I mean, I guess so. From an entertainment perspective, people are generally like, "Oh yeah, do you see how many shots he took? Or how many shots he took, or like, that person's chin is ridiculous." But like, after the praise you might get on Twitter, like, no one sees what you're going through at home. No one sees what you're going through after your career, when your relevancy has passed and you're potentially suffering from multiple injuries. Like, the key is, and has always been actually, for the smart boxers, is not getting hit while hitting. So if we're taking that from boxing, which is the sport that wants the most significant strikes to the head, and you're combining that with things like wrestling, then there should be no reason why you should still be advocating getting hit to the head. It's all about trying to avoid that and making sure you can technically, win against your opponent. So yeah, definitely avoid it.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Me and my brother, he's the person who got me into all sports when I was a child, basically. Yeah. And it started with Formula One, but we loved WWF or WWE. It's obviously
yeah.
And it was brilliant because we were so excited about just watching wrestlers. And obviously at that age, you think it's all real. And the odd thing was, it was a couple of months ago where I'd come across the episode. So the Bella twins, I was just admirable of what they've achieved and also how much they've accomplished as athletes. And then they've got their podcast and I'm listening to what they're talking about, yada, yada, yada. So I'm just like, oh, I've seen this on Channel 5. Let's just play it again. And what they were talking about was, actually, they reprimanded one of the wrestlers because she wasn't listening to the technical advice that the coaches were giving her. And it was like, well, you're dangerous now. And then there was this big hoopla about her being dangerous from some of the moves because she wasn't executing them. Even though it is a fake sport, they do the best they can to protect themselves in all areas. Like, you're looking at neck, lower back. Obviously they didn't mention head then, but you would claim that they would go towards that as well. But in terms of making sure that when they're acting, they're doing it as to portray it as real as possible. But on the flip side of things, the technique has to be of a standard that they're not hurting themselves or the opposite wrestler. So it kind of, I know it's kind of beyond in a different sport, but people call it sport, some people don't. But in terms of, you're still looking at that technical aspect, aren't you? Just to make sure that you are safe, but it's not just for your well-being. It's, you could be debilitated if you have a severe neck injury or something like that.
Absolutely. I think if there's anything that, like, just generally from researching concussion, and it's a difficult one because sometimes, like I said, you're met with a lot of let's just say a lot of backlash because of the fact that you're potentially changing the sport in a manner which affects a lot of people that have been doing the same thing the same way for a very long time. And as someone who who took part in all those things, and to some extent still does, it's one of those things where I think to myself that I don't think enough people appreciate longevity. Enough people don't appreciate being able to stay in the game for longer, or just being able to be healthy for longer, because athletes are not always necessarily the healthiest people all the time. But at some point, you want to still be okay after your sport.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think, and this is very common in fighter mentality, where it's kind of like prize fighting. It's all about glory. It's all about doing it for the moment and what you get out of the moment, what you get from the crowd, and what you get in your prize money. But after that, you'll worry about that later. And I don't think enough people appreciate longevity, being able to stay in the game for a long time, or being able to do other things after that. And one of the best ways you're ever going to be able to do that is protect your brain. So
Yeah,
yeah.
very good point. I like that. I think you've just had the line of the podcast, unless you come up with something, supreme in the next few minutes.
Yeah.
But I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit in terms of neuromuscular fatigue, because I'm so into learning about the brain, learning about the cognition, and at the moment it's learning about female brains. So obviously there's not that much data and knowledge about that side of things.
Absolutely.
But relating to neuromuscular fatigue, it is a big topic of research, especially in central and peripheral factors. Can you give us an insight into your perception of fatigue in sports? How individual coaches monitor this, if they do have say, for example, they don't have the budget to monitor fatigue like the elite sporters do, what can, say, the grassroots or somebody who's coaching a team with not much budget but actually has to have the awareness of neuromuscular fatigue, like what tips can you give coaches or individuals?
So I think the difficulty with neuromuscular fatigue sometimes is just the various factors that like you said, central and peripheral. I think sometimes people get caught up with all of the different types of fatigue within neuromuscular, so to speak. I mean, if we're talking about central, I mean, that can go as far down as something as simple as pacing, where you have maybe voluntarily or somewhat involuntarily decided to control your effort for a certain period of time, just so you can maximize it towards, for example, the end of the game. So there's factors like that where you're conserving effort. There's other factors which you can't necessarily control within the game, such as what's occurring in the blood flow, what's occurring within the muscle in itself. So if we're going straight down to the practical or the applied bit, I think there's two things that people need to understand, or coaches need to understand. There's an element of technology, and then there's the human side to it all as well. So sometimes you get coaches, for example, that absolutely hate technology, but sometimes their perceptions around it are a bit misconstrued, because they might not have the right people interpreting that data. And that without someone interpreting the data, that piece of technology is useless. And then you've got, on the flip side of that, people that over depend on technology, but just forget the human element of fatigue. So I think, like, regardless of your budget, because I mean, a good budget can potentially buy you all the fancy tech, but you start off with the human side of it, which is, how are they necessarily feeling themselves? If you know for a fact that they are up for training today, that's a start. If they themselves feel okay, they've slept okay, and they can report those things, that's always a good start. If the education for them isn't there in terms of how much they should be sleeping, how they feel in the morning, or how they feel prior to engaging in that training session, you've already, like, regardless of what your data says, you've already kind of messed up, so to speak. And obviously, I'm not saying how we would control all these things, because there's so many different things. But then, in addition to that, you want to then be able to look into the whys of why they might not be feeling okay. And when you want to look into that, let's just say, for example, you're using GPS. GPS might tell you how many miles they've covered, for example, within a whole week, and it then might make sense as to how much effort they've been putting in for that week. So that allows you to then start training, adapting everything around it. So I think it's about a combination. But let's just say, for example, you didn't have much of a budget and you were focusing on monitoring fatigue. I think it's about simple performance measures and then sticking to it. So let's just say you have a baseline of, let's just say a certain type of sprint, or very commonly people use things like a drop jump or a counter movement jump. I mean, that's absolutely fine, but just make sure it's not the only factor. Use that as a baseline measure, see the changes across time, but then also look at other factors, look at how many hours they've spent in training, what the overall time spent in training is, how are they feeling themselves, look at all of those factors. And then when you combine that, I think you generally just have a good idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and you make such good points there, and it's kind of goes back to just being a coach. Are you listening to your athletes? Are you listening to your players? The first thing I would ask my clients would be, how you're feeling? And just that one question either kind of unloads everything that's going on in their lives, or it kind of gives you some sort of indication, what is that answer in comparison to what it usually is. Even if they're hiding things, it's like getting to know the players is so understated. But in that flip side of things, they may be only with you for that 1 hour or 2 hours during that day. So are they hydrated? Are they cognitively overloaded? Have they had an argument with a loved one? And all of those things you're not going to know from that data.
No, absolutely not. And I that's why I think, I mean, and it's really hard because I've done some internships at academies and something like that. Generally speaking, the level of communication within the multidisciplinary team isn't great. And I think this is sometimes not ideal for the player, because when you have a good multidisciplinary team, you're kind of aware of every single aspect. You can't control any of them, but you are aware of all of them, and you can start taking that into consideration. And the moment you try to throw out, a whole bunch of factors and think you're the top dog and responsible for all of their performance increases, that's when things become a bit toxic, or you're probably going to do something wrong at some point, because you think you're solely responsible for either a decrement or improvement. It's always a combination of everything that's going forward. So let's just say, for example, you've got an hour with them. Some of the best things to do are just know the list of people that you're about to see within that hour before you've even come to meet them. Maybe get an idea from their let's just say, if you're an S&C coach, maybe you can find out from their technical coaches how things have been within training. I mean, you might have been able to watch what they were doing in the technical session slightly earlier and had an idea of what they were doing coming into that technical session. It's just basically about seeing the whole picture, or at least communicating with people that see the whole picture when you start prescribing exercises or monitoring load, etc., etc.
Yeah, you make another good point, which is funny, because when you're in your own element or your own expertise, it's always good to say, well, this is the most important. But everybody kind of wants to advocate their own work and their own application. But it's a fail safe if we get to know the holistic picture, right? Whereas a lot of people kind of need to put their ego aside to do all of that.
Yeah, definitely.
And before we move on to the quick fires, actually, I'm just going to divert the conversation towards something a little bit different, but it's quite prevalent at this time anyway, as a British Asian. In the world of sport and sports science, tell me about what barriers that you may have come across during your time working in this field. Even, how did your parents find you coming into the field? Because I know my parents were a little bit apprehensive with, what, this is not a lawyer, this is not a business person.
Yeah, or this is not a doctor, right?
Or a doctor, yeah. But then how has that shaped your behavior within this organization or your meetings? Tell us a bit about the background and your experiences of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one. So I remember when I first thought of going to university at the time, I was just like, because I was interested in sport at the time more than anything else. Whereas over the past few years, I've found my love for science again in a manner which, has me in labs as opposed to a pitch now or a field. And I think that's kind of changed a lot for me. But I remember when I first thought of engaging in sport. I didn't think university was the key way to do it. And my mom was like whatever you do, go to university, like that will be the key. And she had no idea what I was studying, but for her it was just a relief that I at least chose to go to university rather than not go. And now she can't pull me out of university because I'm still studying. And the ironic thing is, she still doesn't know what on earth I'm studying, but it's one of those things where I'm all right with her ignorance on the matter, but she starts to understand it a bit better over time. And I think it's this holistic way of viewing things, or your method of communication about certain things. So when I first got involved, it was more about my love for sport and how I wanted to do X, Y, Z, and it didn't appeal to them in any way. I remember once, like, someone was talking to my mum, and they were like, what's Ness up to? And she was just like, yeah, he's just doing his gym studies or whatever he's doing. And I never felt so offended in my life. I was like, gym studies? Really? Like, that's what you're going to reduce it down to? Gym studies? And yeah, it tipped me off, but I realized, obviously, she didn't know any better. And I think over time, she's seen what else it entails. She's seen that it entails a healthier lifestyle. She's seen that it entails understanding the body a bit better. I mean, more recently, she's seen it entails understanding the brain on a new level. So I think it's not what they expected. It's not something that they know to respect either. They don't see sport as a method of success, or a venture for success. But I think sometimes what they see is just, you've gone down a path, and clearly that path is benefiting you or benefiting the people around you, and that's okay to them now, I guess, to some extent. And I guess when you finish a PhD, you still get called a doctor, right? So yeah, not the type that can save lives,
You're
but
such a sly one, getting that in there.
yeah.
It's a doctor. Now you know what, your mum will just be like, oh, my son is a doctor.
Yeah. It still gets done, right?
Exactly.
So
They'll be most proud of you. It's crazy, right? But
it is crazy.
how is, even though you've enjoyed, following this path, and you've got supportive parents and your mum's been supporting you in this element, was there any times where you thought, okay, I feel out on my depth, or I don't quite fit in? Have you ever had that experience during your studies? And how
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, like, it doesn't, full disclaimer, it doesn't bug me, so to speak, but I definitely would say there were times where like when I joined, so I joined St Mary's University, which is in Twickenham, and I was coming from East London at the time. And I joined the strength and conditioning degree because that's kind of like where I started the whole journey. And I think I was the only Asian on the degree. I'm not talking about Southeast Asian. I was the only Asian, like, in general, on the degree. And it's not one of those things you notice instantly, but over time you look around and you're like, there's no one that looks at me. But like, it doesn't bug you, so to speak. I think I've thrived with that. I mean, every single internship I've been to, I've been the only brown one, kind of, for example, in that whole establishment. And sometimes, it can be weird. So, for example, I never had issues with staff members, for example, but whenever I went to games with certain teams, I know for a fact that certain parents looked at me in a way like, what's this guy doing here? And it was one of those things where you're just like, okay, interesting, but yeah, I'm here for a reason, kind of thing. But it's one of those things that you look at bit by bit. And I think, especially with coaching, for me, one of the things that I did differently, and I think it's different for every single person, but after some time in coaching, I didn't feel like it was a pathway, not necessarily for an Asian, and I'm kind of diverting like to another topic here, but I didn't necessarily feel like it was a place to be able to settle or think about families or think about anything else. And it changed, like the outlook changed for me when, I was offered to go, for example, on tour to another country, and it was like on a week's notice. And I was thinking to myself, like, I'm young, I'm at university right now, that clearly has no issues. But at some point in my life, that might have been my job. And I'm not sure I'd have been happy with that, with everything that I might have, had going on. Let's just say I've got a mortgage, or I've got something else. And I think sometimes when I've looked at other people in coaching, or other people even doing PhDs, I've found that some of those real life concerns are not always there, like financial independence, or thinking about moving out of your parents' home, thinking about like moving in with your partner, things like that. I think those were things that I found myself being very different in, not really being an Asian, but it was more about progressing in life in a manner where you're thinking about all of those things. I didn't find I fitted in with many people. And ironically, I got along with mature students in my degree at the time, purely because of the fact that they were at that thinking stage. They were thinking about, their next mortgage payment, or how they were going to run a business on the side of what they were studying. And they ended up being some of my closest friends during my degree. And like, I'm happy to say they've gone on to do big things after they finished their degree as well. And it's great to see. But I think that for me was very different. It's also kind of the reason why I went down a self-funded route for a PhD, because it allowed me to work and do all the other things that I guess normal people are doing, like working a day-to-day job, trying to get into a property ladder maybe, or, settling down and moving in with, their loved ones. And all those things I think were different to the way I saw some of the coaching community. I wouldn't say all of the coaching community, but it was different to the way I saw a lot of the coaching community. Like as an intern, I didn't feel many other coaches were worried about those things. So that was more of an eye-opener for me than anything else.
I like that you've created this unique experience, unique for you, but you've created this kind of idealistic life for yourself. Like, as you said about the self-funded PhD, you are autonomous, you have a level of freedom, and that's what people choose and choose not to do. It's almost like, are you secure and safe in this full-time job, 9 to 5, or do you want to branch out and take your career in a different realm? And I think you kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, almost put all your eggs in one basket, but thought, okay, well, wait a second, I can probably use that egg on that one, and then I'll divert it into this area, and then I'll make them all work for me at the same time. And you've created your own unique path.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate to be able to do that, to be honest. I mean, there were times where you thought it wasn't going to pull through, but I think for me, it was more about thriving in an environment where there were no one basket situations. It was more like, how can I, at some points, you're spreading yourself too far and too thin, but at other points, you're like, well, this has landed me in a very safe position. So it's paid off. So a bit of risk still in that. But definitely not as risky as putting all the eggs in one basket. And personally, I don't think that was the way forward for me. Like, I don't think the coaching was the basket that I wanted to put all my eggs in, because after 2 years of doing internships, I think I saw another reality, which is, for me, this wasn't ideal for someone, for example, who wanted a family or wanted to move down, like the ladder of purchasing a property, or any of those kind of things where you're like, my experience of coaches were, and it wasn't always a bad thing, but like they put it in within the hours that they were expected, which sometimes the evenings, sometimes the mornings. They cared about the athletes, and I love that. But I think some people have the ability to do that, and some people don't, to some extent. So yeah,
I think there's a negative connotation with coaching, whereas you're expected to do that, and when you're expected to do it, you kind of go along with the masses. But when you
definitely
veer away from that traditional coaching role, then you can make it your own, and you can experience more of life and build something that's unique for you, which I don't think many
absolutely
people talk about, which is why I'm
no.
glad you did.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so a few minutes left now. Before we round up,
Okay.
we've got a few
Yep.
quick fires, and this is more about our audience trying to get to know you a little bit more.
Yeah.
And basically, I wanted to ask if there was any other profession you would choose besides being a lecturer and a sports scientist, what would it be and why?
Ooh. Um, I mean, when I was a kid, I did my work experience at an optician's, and I had this idea that I was going to be an optometrist. But I'm definitely not thinking about that now. I mean, I definitely would have loved to have been involved in the basic sciences. You know, something where you know, my brother-in-law is like a microbiologist, and I love some of the stuff that he did. So, I mean, in another world, maybe I would have been looking at petri dishes a lot more than I would have been looking at humans. But yeah, I guess, you know, somewhat of a basic scientist maybe. But yeah.
Yeah. So not really diverting away from the industry, but kind of going into
No,
the element.
no, yeah. I mean, I think that is it. I loved English as well. I mean, I could see myself delving into text and maybe like I don't know if you remember like doing comprehension tests when you're at school and you had to like really look into what you understood from the text and then break down the words. I think in another world I could be doing that, or ideally YouTube reacting to videos all day. But you know, yeah,
That would be
those are my other
amazing.
options.
We're like, we missed
Yeah,
out, right? We could have been
yeah,
doing that.
that'd be great.
And who would you say is your biggest supporter and why?
Oh, difficult one. um, I'd say I have a few. Like my wife, I've been married like for the past 3 years, and she's been amazing in that process. Like we've been through some crazy stuff in terms of moving a few times while I was doing the masters, while I'm doing the PhD now, changing jobs a few times. So like all those things I was talking about, spreading far and thin, like I've done it with her for the past 3 years. And then, I mean, like my supervisors, my mentors, specifically Mark Waldron, he was my supervisor for my undergraduate dissertation, and we published that together. Then I did my master's dissertation with him, and we published that together. And now he's my PhD supervisor, and he's part of a 3-man team. But like without him, I think I would never have thought of academia being a pathway for me. So there's that, and then yeah, like my family, like in terms of my mom and dad, my sisters, and just the friends that keep you grounded when you don't want to think about any of this crap. So like, you know, you're just trying to get into another zone. So yeah.
Great
Yeah,
answers. I love it. It's good that you've obviously showcased how you've got where you are because of the support team around you and your tribe. So that's
definitely.
fantastic. And even though you are a researcher and you're working on your PhD and you're going to let your work speak for itself, which is really admirable.
Hopefully.
And I cannot wait until you publish it so I can actually have a proper read. But
Thanks.
at the moment, with everything going on, if you could go back and change anything regarding your research, what would it be?
Hmm. Um, it's kind of similar to what I said in the first thing about changing a career, but I think if I could go back and change the scope of my research, I think it would have been just to be able to go into a lot more depth about the brain first. Like I wish, not that I don't wish I came from a sport background, because strength and conditioning was the way it started for me. It ignited a passion for science that I found later in my master's and my PhD. But if I could go back and maybe add something as opposed to replace something, it would it would be I wish I had maybe, you know, gone back in time and added, for example, like a neuroscience degree or something where I had such a big, a vast base to start with, where I knew all of those things in addition to my understanding of the sports that I'm researching into, and then I come at it from both angles,
Mhm.
rather than I understand the sport, I understand the mechanisms of the sport, I understand what people go through because I've been through it myself. But I also wish, you know, I could combine that information together, as opposed to, because the PhD is a lot of self study and a lot of grafting of trying to understand concepts yourself. So I wish I'd been through some taught modules where I was the dumb one in the room at the time, just learning all of those things from scratch, and then coming together with all this information. That would have been the idea. But in terms of concussions, I don't think I'll replace that, because yeah, I'm too obsessed with those right now.
So is that another PhD or another degree that I can keep learning?
I wouldn't say another PhD, hell no. But I mean, like I've done some stuff on the side where like I've been looking at translational neurology, which is more to do with like how studies from rats kind of eventually translate into humans. So I'm kind of doing a bit of that now to some extent. But like I wish, at a stage where you're learning things from scratch, I wish I had maybe a background, for example, from I don't know if it's an additional degree, but like just something where it may have been 2 extra modules or 1 extra year spent on doing that. Or even, let's just say, for example, you know how you do one of those placements where you go abroad and you learn all these techniques, and you meet others from other labs and stuff like that. Any of those things basically would have been great. So yeah.
Great answer. I love it. Now, we ask all of our guests this, and we basically try and delve a little bit deeper into not only who influences in your work, outside of work. It could be anybody. It could be related to work, or it could be somebody personal to you. But who would you recommend to be a guest on Unapologetically You? Who would you like to hear from if you were a listener?
So on the topic of when I was at St. Mary's and I started off in strength and conditioning, I got along with a few students, namely mature students. There was Stefan, there was Fran, there was Michael Wheeler, and I think 2 of the ones that I've mentioned, they're not generally on social media much, but Fran, he was one of the mature students that like we used to kind of ace exams together. We used to do like all these things, and he was a personal trainer at the time. He then went on to work with Fulham, and I believe now he is the S&C coach for Arsenal Women's.
Okay.
So Fran Silva, I'd love to hear from him now to see what else he's getting up to, because like I love my few years of having deep, thoughtful conversations with him and Michael when I was at uni. But like we've all moved on to hopefully bigger and better things. So I'd love to see his journey from there. That would have been amazing.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we can get him on and twist his arm saying, well, a friend.
Yeah.
And lastly, thank you so much for just taking time out and talking about all your expertise. I think we could just, if you add another hour, we can just carry on talking. It's
totally
really hard to try kind of slim it down for about an hour, but how can people get in touch and find your research online? How do people get in touch with you on social media? Let us know so we can actually...
Yeah, sure. So I run a little blog page every once in a while when I get time to update it. It's physcom.org. So phys and then just com.org. But I don't actually know my own Twitter handle, which is terrible. But I'll make sure the link is available.
We'll find it and we'll put it in the description below.
Thanks, Tulsi. But yeah, I mean, like generally through Twitter and the website, you'll generally see updates from me, like any new research or just anything related to concussions, hydration, anything of the sort. So if that tickles your fancy, then yeah, you can get in touch through there, and I'll make sure to respond and have a good conversation, hopefully.
Well, hopefully we can get you back on when Kelly is available.
That'd be awesome.
She's absent today, but yeah, maybe when it's published, you can talk about your research next, and then we'll delve into that aspect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much.
Looking forward to that. No, thank you for having me, and thanks to John for recommending me as well.
Yes, we had to thank John as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me and listening to the Unapologetically You podcast. As always, if you wanted to stay in touch and get more information on Unapologetically You, we are available on Patreon, where you can find exclusive podcasts way before they air to the public. And you get to have exclusive access to our green room chats, where we just chit-chat, general conversations. So if you wanted to check those out, please head over to Patreon. The link is in the description below. And I will see you for the next time of Unapologetically You. Take care.